Louisa, for the invitation, and Hendrik and Cecilia. Look forward to your comments. I've been a skeptic of these types of virtual forums, but you've proven me wrong. This has been an incredibly valuable series. Perhaps two caveats before I start. The first is that, as you mentioned, I'm not in Singapore. I'm talking about Singapore. So my perspective is very much looking from the outside in. And so I'm thinking more about global connections and comparisons rather than perhaps the everyday experience of being in Singapore. Perhaps there are others on the call who are better placed to talk about that. And the second is that I'm not an architect or someone who studies health. I am an urban geographer and I study space and spatial politics. So that's the angle that I'm coming from. The theme of my talk is rescaling and the way that space and place are networked and rescaled, especially in this context of COVID and the authoritarian responses to COVID. And perhaps it's appropriate as I'm, as you mentioned, based at an English university, but I'm currently located in the United States, talking to you in different time zones around the world. So we are very well acquainted with the way that space is networked and rescaled. And I'm assuming you can all see my screen at this point and hear me. Okay, that's good. On a date in late June every year since 2009, thousands of Singaporeans converge on Hong Lim Park, a 0.94 hectare grassy square to commemorate and support LGBTQ life in the city-state. The event has grown over its 12-year history from around 2,500 attendees to more than 25,000 by 2019, becoming the largest annual civil society gathering in the country. That such a large public gathering occurs in space-constricted Singapore is notable. There are many restrictions on public assembly, including the Public Order Act, which stipulates how public space can or cannot be used. That Pink Dot is an LGBTQ-themed event is even more notable. Singapore maintains restrictions on LGBTQ life and expression, including the Section 377A of the Penal Code, first instituted by the British in the 1930s, which criminalizes homosexuality. So for a number of reasons, the success of Pink Dot, both its visibility as a public gathering and its global representation as a marker of civil rights, are remarkable. Enter, in February 2020, COVID-19. Like many cities and countries, Singapore responded forcefully, instituting strict shelter-in-place orders and restricting access to public spaces like Hong Lim Square, which is pictured here. Even relative to other places, Singapore became known quickly for its authoritarian response to the crisis. One example of this was the mandatory quarantine of all international arrivals for 14 days, with frequent checks and surveillance to ensure compliance. Seen as an efficient and effective response, these measures have been borrowed and implemented elsewhere too, with the United Kingdom and other countries now considering, now implementing similar mandatory quarantines for international arrivals, including myself in a few weeks. Singapore's authoritarian state society apparatus is sometimes seen as an alternative model, where the civil liberties are curtailed in order for city life to be optimized. And the Singapore model is a frequent referent for successful urban development and governance and placemaking agendas. So the fact that its COVID-19 response has been lauded is not surprising. However, early successes obfuscated a sobering reality. Singapore is dependent on migrant labor, and most manual jobs, construction, landscaping, domestic work, etc., are filled by men from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and India, and women primarily from the Philippines. The men live in crowded company-sponsored dormitories on the city's fringe. These laborers are ubiquitous in Singapore. At the same time, they are rendered invisible. Constructors of the city's lavish buildings and gardens, but absent from public life and public space. On Sundays, these and other domestic workers are free to congregate and socialize on their day off from work. Parts of Singapore's Little India, for example, which is pictured on the right here, are overtaken by throngs of foreign workers who use the time and space to meet up with friends or connect with those from their hometowns. Public spaces, streets, plazas, hawker food centers, and department stores like the legendary 24-hour Mustafa are central to both the socialization of migrant laborers, but also to provide a platform for visibility and to form relationships to and with the city. The outbreak of COVID-19 among the migrant workers erased this visibility as tens of thousands of workers were quarantined out of sight in their residential living facilities. A dual narrative then emerged with two competing but very different images circulated and recirculated via global media. One version of Singapore that had successfully fought and conquered COVID-19, reopening and allowing occupation of public space once again by citizens deemed not to be a threat. And another version where migrant workers were condemned to suffer in clammy, air-conditioned dormitories, out of sight and mind, removed from public space altogether. Likewise, Singapore's LGBTQ community, which emerges into visibility each June by occupying Hong Lim Park, was also shut inside, relegated to the private sphere of domesticity, present but invisible. So I want to trouble the notion slightly that authoritarian responses to COVID-19 and restrictions on public space are some sort of Singaporean unique characteristic. Places like Singapore and also Hong Kong to some degree are often under the global microscope as another model, as what can happen in an authoritarian response. And I think that as we've seen in the past several months, we've learned that authoritarianism is not reduced to place. It is rather a global process, and that the fact that perhaps some of these restrictions on public space have always been the case outside of places like Singapore. Indeed, we've seen the trend of privatization of public space, hyper-surveillance, police and racialized brutality. These have been facets of daily life in the West for a long time. So I want to sort of trouble this notion that we can look to places like Singapore as global unique models to learn from. Rather, I think we should be learning from, in some ways, ourselves, learning from how these processes play out. And what COVID-19 has done has accelerated these processes and made the planetary nature of them more visible. And in fact, some of the very particular restrictions on public space in Singapore, as I mentioned, were implemented during the colonial era. These were British laws that were instituted mostly in the 1930s and 40s against the dissent in the Maoist uprisings that were taking place across the region at the time. So this is the other narrative of Singapore that started to happen in April when there was an outbreak in its migrant worker dormitories. And so the first month of the pandemic had very few cases, and many countries started to rapidly adopt what Singapore was doing. And then around mid-April, there was a massive spike in cases. And these were mostly taking place in places pictured here, these dormitories that were clearly unsanitary and overcrowded. And unfortunately, I would argue that many places have also instituted this type of response, that we've had an uneven response in many cities, and informal settlements have been cloistered in much the same way. At the same time, public spaces have become rescaled globally. We've seen this the way that the plight of the migrant workers has become a globally networked discussion piece, that the migrant workers may be invisible inside Singapore's borders, but on the web, it's become part of global media. Much bigger representation and visibility in the public sphere than perhaps would ever be possible in the territory of the city-state. And likewise with Pink Dot, the LGBTQ gathering, which cannot take place anymore in the park, but not only is it networked with sister events in places like London and places not currently in lockdown, it's also networked online. You can see the Pink Dot Facebook group has 68,000 likes, which is far bigger than could ever physically gather. in space. Another interesting angle is the way that we're seeing a mix of public space, local state, and global market. The way that social media companies like Facebook are forming another scale of public space and are both subject to territorial laws and larger, creating their own laws. The way that, for example, Trumpian rhetoric on fake news has merged with Singapore's efforts to restrict digital discourse, and Facebook, which operates inside and outside of the city-state, has formed a new frontier of public space. So I think I'm coming to my time. Just to conclude, again, the theme today was learning from cities, and I pose the Singapore example, not so much that we can learn from Singapore as some kind of unique model worthy of study, but rather as an example of the accelerated authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world. That is not a new thing, but it's been brought into stark relief, the way that Singapore is a sort of mediator, a simulacrum of global authoritarian imagery, mediated by local space, by the global space of places like Facebook, Silicon Valley, makes combinations and reattaches to space. And I think that we as researchers and urbanists might do well to look in the mirror and understand our role in creating some of these spaces in many places. So thank you very much.